All right, so I want to get into this book. Very good book I found here. I'm glad I found this. It's called Bound Over: Indentured Servitude and American Conscience by John Van Dersey, forward by John Patrick Diggins. This is from 1985. And I just want to show real quick, this is in the back of the book, the sources, very scholarly book, primary sources. All right, you can see it's a very long list. And this is in the introduction of the book. And it says here, what exactly was on the minds of the English, Irish, Scottish, German, and other immigrants when they said, let's get out, let's go to America? Thanks to John Van Dersey, Bound Over, his book that we're reading right now, we know now the reasons that prompted many Europeans to come to America and the conditions in which they arrived. Some were between one half and two-thirds of all the colonists came to the New World as what? Voluntary what? Slaves, indentured servants. Well, they'll say that voluntary, but we know, right, to dodge the hijack, we know a lot of them were being kidnapped or convicted felons and all that, undesirables that were being sent over here. It says indentured servants, apprentices, tenants, bond servants, and the like, all agreeing to the status of redemptioneer in one form or another. A person who, lacking the means, accepts free transportation as the price of 4 to 7 years of unrelenting servitude to an unknown master. As Van der Sea makes clear, memories of servitude weighed heavily on the minds of leaders like Tom Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Joseph Galloway, and Alexander Hamilton. All right, big one right there, right? So, right, I did a video, right, on Benjamin Franklin. He was an indentured servant. He was a servant to his dad, supposedly. And he ran away. He was a runaway slave, basically. He was a runaway slave. That's why he ran away, because he was treated like property. Benjamin Franklin. Now they're letting us know here Alexander Hamilton, Joseph Galloway, and Tom Paine as well. These people were all indentured servants. But it remains to be considered whether those who had once felt the tyranny of servitude would emerge as classical Republicans, dedicated to civic duty, or economic liberals, aspiring to individual opportunity. It says, in any event, Van der Sea shows how the experience of indentured servitude made many Americans not only suspicious of British rule, but keenly aware of man's tendency to exploit fellow men, an attitude deeply felt in the debates over the Constitution and continuing into the Civil War itself. What Lincoln learned from the Bible, his successor, remember Lincoln, the so-called Negro, Lincoln, President Andrew Johnson, an ex-indentured servant. Oh, Andrew Johnson, and what an ex-indentured servant learned from personal experience. Bound Over: Indentured Servitude and American Conscience by John Van Dersey. Introduction. On November 30th, 1774, the brig London Packet docked at Philadelphia. Its chief cargo, not usual for the time, all right, not usual for the time, we're talking about 1774, right, was 122 indentured servants, British and continental men and women who would be bound into servitude for an average of 4 years in exchange for passage. Probably some had agreed to a certain term in England. Others would have to bargain with agents, masters or ship owners here. A certain number may have been transported for criminal offenses. A few may have been kidnapped or shanghaied by unscrupulous labor contractors. All of these were common practices in the American servant trade. The American servant trade. All right, we're not talking about Africans here. We're talking about that in 1774, it was the usual thing to see ships come in full of people, full of indentured servants, full ships, right? Servant ships or slave ships. What do you want to call it? Huh? They were packed in there like herons, remember. Now listen to this, except for the important distinction that their existence as individuals was acknowledged by law, and that after their term of servitude they were to be granted the full rights of freemen and women. The status of these people was essentially the same as that of slaves. Again, the status of these people was essentially the same as that of slaves. This is slave. This is how slavery became. Should tell. It was through indentured servitude. They were extending these indentures for life. They The work they did and the clothes on their backs belonged entirely to their masters. They could be hired out, sold, or auctioned, even if this meant separating them from their families. They could be beaten, whipped, or branded, all right? This is where you get that whole story. Indentured servitude, these people went through that. If they ran away, they could be punished. By an extension, often a multiplication of their term of servitude. In some colonies, runaways were hanged, a process too wasteful to apply to slaves, who retained, after all, the value of capital. The resemblance to enslavement began at least at embarkation, where both voluntary and involuntary immigrants were herded on board. White Guinea men, it says there, white Guinea men, and crammed below decks in unsanitary conditions with insufficient provisions. This is the Middle Passage here. Again, Middle Passage. They're crossing the Atlantic Ocean from Europe in these conditions. All right, we're going to ignore this. You want to make up stories like Kunta Kinte. You want to put it, oh, it was Africans. It was all these Negroes. No, these are Europeans, both pale skin and melanated Europeans as well, colored Europeans together. They were what? Being packed in these ships, crammed below decks in unsanitary conditions with insufficient provisions. On the London packet, this had meant 9 weeks of confinement in a stifling hold, 9 weeks in the ocean. A Middle Passage in what? In a stifling hold, and an outbreak of putrid fever that had swept through the entire ship. 5 bodies had been thrown overboard en route, and no more than 5 people among the complement of indentured cabin passengers and crew had escaped infestation. You hear this? People will comment on my videos, on these type of videos especially, be like, but it's not the same. Nobody's comparing, first of all. But these people went through the same thing that you supposedly Kunta Kinte went through. Supposedly, that's a fictional story, and I'm reading you a real story right now. You know, remember they're talking about the ship that came in with all these people, and it says among the deceased cabin passengers was a marginally free man, a failed schoolmaster, staymaker, and preacher, who had barely been able to scrape together the price of his passage. In this atmosphere of incarceration, disease, and fortified human rights, he made his passage to the New World, an appendage of a practice developed for the population of it. Such passage, remember this Middle Passage, right? Middle Passage was a fearful demonstration of the fragility of human freedom, as well as the fierce price of slipping back into servitude. The experience was to mark the man, just as the disease festering among the indentured below deck marked him now, leaving him so weakened that he had to be carried off the ship, disembarking only after the rest of the passengers and crew had left. Thus, Thomas or Tom Paine arrived in America. All right, they're talking about Thomas Paine. Who's this Tom Paine? He came in under these conditions. Who's Thomas Paine that came in under the slave conditions? We're going to go to Britannica Encyclopedia.com or Britannica.com, and it's Thomas Paine, it says here, right? Now, Thomas Paine, it says here, born in Norfolk, England. He died in 1809, New York, English-American writer and political pamphleteer whose Common Sense Pamphlet and Crisis papers were important influences on the American Revolution. So he contributed to the American Revolution, the same person who came in as a slave, remember, under those conditions that he had to be carried off the ship. He almost died on the way over here. All right, so we continue in this book. And right here it talks about how Washington basically liked, this guy Thomas Paine's readings or his literature, what he wrote. And it says Washington, we're talking about George Washington, moved by this article, ordered it to be read aloud to his brigades. He too, plantation owner, slaveholder, aristocrat, had been associated with indentured servitude. As a British officer in the French and Indian War, Washington had urged upon the colonial authorities the enlistment of servants in the Virginia Volunteers, warning that if such provision were not made, servants would run off and enlist in the regular army anyway. He himself recruited numbers of indentured servants for his regiment. All these Europeans, who they fighting? It is the forgotten social undercurrent of the American Revolution. All right, This is the true reason of the American Revolution, indentured servitude, and all these Europeans fighting to fight their status and for their freedom, their liberty, and the tyranny they were under indentured servitude, the desperate sucking tide that made the unthinkable challenge to the most powerful naval and military force on earth a worthwhile risk, and prompted the guarantees of individual rights written into government that evolved afterwards. We are, in fact, as Americans, listen to what he's going to say. We are, in fact, as Americans, the descendants of bound people. All these Americans, all these white Americans, all these people talking about love it or leave it, or, this is the America, get out or go back to Africa, all that stuff. They are the ones descended from bound people. I've been showing you a lot in the other videos. How many hours in the other videos? How many sources did I show? And I got more sources on this part, and I got way more to show. I don't know how many parts I'm going to do because it just keeps popping up because it is part of history. I keep finding this. It's part of history. It's real history. History they never told us about. History they sugarcoated. History they whitewashed. History they erased. History they hid. Because the fact is that most Americans are descendants of bound people. And we're not talking about the aboriginal original people here that were never, ever bound. Tied now by that binding in ways we have forgotten, which it would serve us well to remember. They're gonna remember now. Oh, they're gonna hear it now. They're gonna remember now. Ain't no turning back. From 1609 until well after the founding of the Republic, half of all the colonists who came to America arrived under some form of involuntary labor. And they're being modest here with these numbers. Half of all the colonists? How much millions is that? Do the numbers. Now, times that, times all their descendants that are alive today. How they multiplied and they call themselves the white, so-called white American, or what you want to call so-called black American. A lot of the so-called black Americans are descendants of the same European-bound people of color. People of North Africa, Sephardic Jews they didn't want, Huguenots they didn't want, Black Germans they didn't want, Protestants, Quakers, Swarthy, I'm talking about swarthy complexioned Europeans. Yes, you can't deny that part if it's in your genealogy. Actually look into it and see what else you can dig on it. We gotta accept every part of you. If you have whatever you have in your family, you gotta cherish it and understand it, know who you are. Because, again, from 1609 until way after, till basically ever, until today, half of all the colonists supposedly came in as involuntary labor. To them fell the largest share of the hardest work in an unfamiliar country. They cleared the land. Again. All right, this is a very scholarly book. There's so many sources in this. I already showed you in the beginning before I read it. It's on the way in the back. You want to, again, verify all the info. It's called Bound Over, Indentured Servitude, and American Conscience. All right, that's the name of the book. You can check out all the sources he has. You can verify all the information. We have already verified the information we're reading in this book. This is part 4. But I want you to pay attention to what he's going to say. And what he just said, he said, to them, to who? To these indentured servants, these convicts, these undesirables, these people they didn't want over there, political prisoners. All right? All of them, all these indentured servants, to them fell the largest share of the hardest work in an unfamiliar country. The hardest work, not to Africans. The hardest work fell to indentured servants from Europe. They cleared what? The land, drained the swamps, built the roads, first plowed the unbroken ground. They cooked and cleaned and nursed and midwifed. They worked and died in greater numbers than anyone else. Theirs were the hands and backs that worked the transformation from wilderness to settled prosperity, a change so sweeping that its signs have vanished, so that the completed colonies seem somehow to have sprung fully into being directly from their charters. In the process, these men and women, drifters and convicts, rogues and whores, and the chronically poor, reluctant, coerced, unpaid, overworked, overwhelmingly ignorant and unskilled, vanished themselves, transformed into what we have come to think as of the American people. Any questions?
Any
All right,
questions?
that was so deep right there. I hope you understand. This is the main point I've been trying to show you. All
Deep.
right, and I hope you guys have been understanding the last three parts of this.
Let them know, Kurimeo.
When I was saying the invention of the white race and how they created this segregation. Today, all these American people, right? All these American people, a lot of these American people descend from indentured servants, both pale skin and people of color. So when we're reading, don't just think white when I'm saying they worked the hardest jobs and all this. There's also colored people in this. When they're saying, because you know how we grew up, and everybody always knew that it was the so-called slave, right, that built everything. The so-called slave, the Negro, right, so-called Negro or African slaves. Oh, they built the White House, they built the roads, right? Well, it was slaves slash indentured servants, and there was so-called Negroes in, in that mix, but there was also pale-skinned people, Europeans. To them fell the hardest work. To your Europeans who were coming here as indentured servants, both pale-skinned and so-called Negro. And with time, they vanished themselves. What happened to them? They transformed into what we have come to think as the American people.
The
But you want to
American.
keep associating yourself to being a slave or to everything that is slavery, everything related to slavery. That's what you keep wanting to associate yourself with, right? You want to identify as the persons who built the roads, who had to enslave, who had to go through all this hardship. That's what they want you to envision. But a lot of your ancestors were never even indentured servants or slaves and owned land and
Facts.
actually owned indentured servants.
Facts.
So this is just something for you to think about. Again, we're in the book Bound Over, Indentured Servitude and American Conscience. Introduction, just to finish it up. And it goes into basically the point I was saying earlier about the American Revolution and who these people really were. And right before I read this, they explain how, it really wasn't about really caring about people. It was more of a political thing. But what were they really fighting if all they talk about is slavery and tyranny and all this stuff and being free and liberty? Who were they talking about? Were they talking about? They weren't talking about just the so-called Negro, because they had slaves. Remember, these people had indentured servants. They didn't care really about that. So it says here, why were the acts of the colonial authorities and of Parliament so often linked by colonial speakers and pamphleteers? So people in media, like the people in the media, right, or in publishing and making the books, commercial ads, advertisements. All right, so why would these speakers, motivational speakers, public speakers, pamphleteers, Samuel Adams, John Adams, James Otis, Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, Stephen Hopkins, Joseph Galloway, with slavery and tyranny? There was only one British practice which could and did actually subject colonial men and women to tyranny and enchantment. So they're saying there was only one real reason what they were really fighting, and it was basically, in that time, the only thing that existed was indentured servitude that kind of affected colonial people. It didn't just affect so-called African slaves, right? Because we're learning, right, that it's all Europeans that it was affecting. So these people are being affected by that. And this is the main thing they were fighting for. Their cause was the whole indentured servitude system. The experience of servitude was both widespread and intensely personal. The practice was present, at least at settlement stages, in every colony. Again, in every colony, since the very beginning, they're saying at least, no, all the way up until the 1800s. We already know that. We read this before. All right, so this was there since the early stages of the colonies. The most prosperous colonies, Virginia and Pennsylvania, were economically founded on it. They were founded. Virginia and Pennsylvania was because of indentured servitude, not because of African slavery. They didn't owe it to African slavery, their establishment. It was because of the indentured servitude system. Moreover, the uprooting and transplanting of people to the new world When we mean people, they mean Europeans, usually occurring in youth, in some cases in childhood, involving the separation from parents, brothers, sisters, and a home, produced, as we shall see over and over again, the kind of emotional trauma that individuals never entirely escape and whose effects resounded through the decades. No other colonial experience was so common and at the same time so profound. Basically, they didn't care about no African slaves or people of color or people coming from Africa. That was not the real reason of the whole American Revolution and freedom or even the Civil War, any of that. All right, these people were going through their own indentured servitude. A lot of these people were indentured servants slash slaves. That's the hijack. Thus, people with dissimilar and sometimes conflicting interests could be united into a common opposition that focused and directed their deepest energies and frustrations against a single target. The old world hierarchy extended to the new, the transporting authority under which they had been brought over, in which they were under, brought over under. They were under this system of indentured servitude. This is how they got here as slaves. They were brought over here as slaves, as indentured servitudes from the old world. Yeah, so-called old world. This is the true old world. But they mean England, right? Their mother country, which continued to rule them with potentially arbitrary power of a servant's master, in which, in order to be truly autonomous individuals, they would have to discard. All right, so they would have to get rid of that system, is what he's saying. That indentured servitude, that's what they were really fighting for, the Revolutionary War. And you know what? They even use indentured servants to do that. It's so ironic, right? On both sides.